hello, welcome or welcome back to the channel. My name is Ria and this video is about the 8 sequence structure, which is a very popular plot structure that I use whenever I'm drafting my novels. So I've mentioned this a few times in a few other vlogs that I've had and a few sit-down videos, but the 8 sequence structure is something that has been a lifesaver, especially when I'm writing the first draft of my novel. And I use it so often that honestly it's become a crutch. Like, I have to figure out what sequence I'm in, where I'm at in that structure in order to figure out what needs to happen next sometimes. And I have written 2 novels and it has proved to be very, very helpful. Just some background about the 8 sequence structure. I was first introduced to this idea by a video that Victoria Aveyard, the author of Red Queen, posted on her Instagram because she uses this structure frequently in writing her novels. The structure is actually really commonly used by screenwriters, but it translates really well into writing novels. So some history about the 8 sequence structure: it was used back when the theaters had to change reels whenever they were playing the films, and so they had to write a structure in which there was a very important cliffhanger in the middle of the movie so that people wouldn't leave while the reels were being changed. So I've got a legal pad with kind of like an outline of what the structure looks like, and then I've got my laptop pulled up with some notes for you guys, and I'm going to be linking a lot of things in the description about everything I talk about. I primarily reference 2 or 3 websites whenever I'm writing to help me whenever I get stuck with the 8 sequence structure. And there is this sort of diagram that really helps me out whenever I'm writing to kind of visualize things. So basically what the 8 sequence structure does, it breaks the whole plot into 8 mini scenes, or sorry, 8 mini sequences, and it's a whole lot easier to write those 8 sequences, so write a story 1 sequence at a time, than write the whole novel at once. You can break the 8 sequence structure down even further, and you can break it into 3 acts. In Act 1, you have 25% of the story, that's 2 sequences. Act 2, you have 50% of the story, which is 4 sequences, and then Act 3, you have the last 2 remaining sequences, which is the other 25%. So Act 1 gets sequence 1 and 2. Each of those sequences have their own kind of purpose and significance. Sequence 1 is primarily going to be about introduction. This is a sequence where we meet all these characters, we get introduced to sort of like the conflict a little bit and learn like the basic premise of the story. Sequence 1 usually ends with an inciting incident. So right here in this line, so right here, I've written it just now, the inciting incident happens right at the end of sequence 1. Then we go into sequence 2, which is the dilemma. So basically in sequence 2 is like the call to action, the debate of whether or not to leave and go and do this big adventure and kind of proceed into the unknown. By the end of sequence 2, the protagonist has taken some kind of action that will change their lives forever and basically gets the ball rolling. Okay, so that is the end of Act 1. That's kind of all that needs to happen in Act 1. Then we get into Act 2. So primarily Act 2 is where most people kind of get stuck writing and has like the kind of the what's the word? Like the story kind of sags in Act 2, mostly because it's a lot harder to write Act 2 than it is to write Act 1. Sequence 3, Act 2, we have entered like this whole new world. Remember, the protagonist has left everything they've known to enter sort of like unknown. That is kind of what's going on in Act 3. We're introducing that world. The protagonist faces their like first real like obstacle. So here's where you raise the stakes. And then also if there's any remaining exposition from Act 1 that you didn't use or didn't mention, so here's where you can also introduce a few more subplots. Like Act 1 is really about introducing all the main plots, but hinting at potential future sub-conflicts. You can introduce more of those subplots in depth, and kind of in doing that you can raise the stakes a little bit more. So this is going to feel kind of quick, but Act 4 is the midpoint. Honestly, it's perfectly placed. I feel like it feels a lot faster than it actually is, but that's because a lot of authors face the second act sag, and that comes from kind of dragging the story out when it should be hitting the midpoint in sequence 4. Whatever the consequences of what the character has done in sequence 3, so remember, they've left what they've known and then they are taking action in a new world that they're unfamiliar with. Whatever actions they've taken in that new world can lead to a midpoint in sequence 4. Okay, so you can see that that's the midpoint right there. This raises the stakes again. What has worked really well, a really great expectation from the midpoint, is that it is almost like a pre-climax. Because that is where the story can sag the most, having a really strong midpoint can carry the story through a second act sag. And usually this is a moment where the character goes from getting acted on to acting on. Basically, the character goes from passive to active. So instead of having things happen to them, they are making decisions and making things happen for them. The midpoint is also a point where the main character faces the central conflict in some way. It doesn't have to be as direct as the climax will be, but it has to be some kind of like face-to-face with the main conflict. So sequence 5, because of the midpoint, sequence 5 is generally called like the twists and turns. The rising action essentially of the story happens in sequence 5. This is because the midpoint has to leave the character with some kind of consequence that they have to face in sequence 5. Testing the characters, relationships with the other characters, kind of pulling in the subplots and raising the stakes for the subplots. Tensions just rising, things that even they thought were going to be easy are suddenly not as easy. Whatever growth that the character has had up until sequence 5, they're kind of rebelling against that. They're kind of breaking out of their shell, becoming a person that they have to be in order to face the conflict ultimately in the end. Sequence 5 is a lot of character development, a lot of subplot development, a lot of more tensions rising, stakes rising, that sort of thing. Basically, the characters and the story are being put to the test in sequence 5. And then one of my favorite sequences, sequence 6. Sequence 6 is where it all kind of comes to a head. All of the hard work and everything that has been put into solving the central conflict for the main character can go either one of two ways for sequence 6. There is a recognized sort of plot structure in that if the book is about to end in a tragedy, so if at the end of the book the character's going to lose everything, things are not happening in the character's way, if that is how the book is going to end, sequence 6 has to be a high point for the character. It has to end on a very good note. The characters look like they've got what they wanted, they're doing well, they've had some sort of success, they look like they're happy, like things have been working out for them, and then we introduce Act 3 and kind of mess it up for them. If Act 3 is going to end well for the characters, relatively well, then Sequence 6 has to be a really low point. The end of Sequence 6 has to be a super low point for the characters. It's like those parts of the movie where you're just like, I don't know how they're going to get out of this. They're trapped, they don't know how they're going to escape, that sort of thing. It's like they've lost everything and there's just no way that they could ever get out of this. Like, it is the lowest point of the draft. So basically it would happen here. So it would be either the low point or the high point, depending on how your Act 3 ends. So then we go directly into Sequence 7, which is now Act 3. So Act 2 ends on either a very high point or low point. Act 3, Sequence 7 is the climax. This is where everything kind of comes together. This is the second midpoint, I like to call it, because the midpoint is a huge, huge deal, and I like to make my midpoints super dramatic. So Sequence 7 is basically like a second midpoint, and this is what everything has been leading up to. This is the reason we wrote the book. This is the big fight, the big confrontation where it's like you either fight or you die, like a huge moment in the story. Everything that has been building up, all of these stakes are now on the line with Sequence 7. If you have a twist in your story, if there's a moment where the character at their lowest point can figure something out, find a solution, it usually happens at the end of Sequence 7, and that is usually where the twist ends up. The twist is how they kind of save themselves and kind of get out of that conflict. So you can see that the twist goes right there. And then Sequence 8 is the final sequence. It's the resolution of the story. Everything that needs to happen has happened. You're kind of tying up loose ends, figuring things out, closing the plots, closing the subplots, giving everything a decent conclusion. All of that end of the hill kind of thing is happening in Sequence 8. I literally use this every time I write a draft, every time I write a first draft. It helps me so much that I am like always worried that what if this doesn't work and I'm kind of stranded and I wouldn't know how to write a draft without this. So I would highly, highly recommend using this structure or checking it out and kind of seeing if it works for you. I have previously tried to use the Save the Cat beat sheet. Didn't really work for me. I don't know, I just couldn't figure out how to structure my story around it. Also, the 5-act structure didn't really work for me. Just the 3-act structure alone doesn't work for me, but using the 3-act structure in combination with the 8-sequence structure really does it for me for some reason. I hope that it helps you out somewhat, because honestly, this is a lifesaver. All the links that I use to reference whenever I'm writing a draft, I'm gonna put them in the description. If I can find the video on YouTube of Victoria Aveyard walking through Red Queen and how she uses 3-sequence structure or the 8-sequence structure for Red Queen, I will also put that in the description. But yeah, that is all for this video. I hope that you learned something from it. I hope that this was helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.